So without further ado, our first speaker is StephanLewandowsky, who's had a lot to do with organising tonight's event, who will speak on consensus in science. What does it mean? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Carmen. Can you hear me? This should be on. Okay, thanks very much. I also want to welcome you to the event tonight, and so do certain other people around the country, including this online edition of Quadrant, which is welcoming you to what must be one of the most shameful events in our country's intellectual history, with a university psychologist, that's me, discussing the perils of climate skepticism. Now, of course, you will have noticed that this is upside down. The reason I put it upside down is because they couldn't even get that right. They completely inverted what I'm actually going to do, because in reality, what I'm going to do is to talk about the consensus in climate science. I'll report various data on that consensus within the scientific community. I will point to a precedent for what it means and the risk people are running when they ignore a scientific consensus. And then I'll talk about actually the rewards of real skepticism. So it's a completely different reality from what's being reported out there. And that is a theme that we unfortunately will have to revisit throughout the various talks today. Now, the first point I want to make, and the first thing I want to present evidence for, is that there is an overwhelming consensus within the scientific community that the Earth is warming and that humans are responsible. Now, how would I know that? I know that from a number of different lines of evidence. This is now perhaps somewhat outdated. Naomi Oreskes, who incidentally will be visiting here in November this year, she analyzed the abstract of nearly 1,000 peer-reviewed papers on climate change and found that, well, 100% either implicitly or explicitly conformed or endorsed the consensus position, while none disagreed. Now that has changed a little bit. A more recent update of this analysis performed by Dr. Lambert at the University of New South Wales. He looked at another 576 papers, found that there were at most 3 that explicitly rejected the consensus. So we have a score of roughly 1,497 out of 1,500, thereabouts. We also have evidence for the consensus within the scientific community through various surveys. This one was published in a referee journal just last year. They asked about 3,000 Earth scientists 2 questions. Is the climate warming? Are humans responsible? So it's the minimum set of questions you can ask people to find out what they think. And those who published on climate change, of them 97% said yes, and only a very small number said no. So that's what one would presumably call a consensus. About a week ago, yet another paper came out in the referee literature proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in the US. They examined not just scientists, but also their publications. So they did what's called a bibliometric analysis of the publication record. They generously included a lot of papers in publication that might not really be peer-reviewed publications, and they came to exactly the same conclusion. About 97 to 98% of the actual experts in the field endorse the consensus. It's therefore not surprising that all the major scientific organizations in the world are explicitly endorsing the consensus, such as the UK Royal Society, American Associations for the Advancement of Science, National Academies of all G8 countries, including Australia. Here's a list of the organizations that oppose the consensus. For saying that, one might notice that these are not known for their scientific progress. Most recently, about a month ago, the National Academy in the US released the following statement, which is perhaps the strongest statement I've seen in science in my lifetime. It's worth reading out. Some scientific conclusions have been so thoroughly examined and tested that their likelihood of being wrong is vanishingly small. Such conclusions are regarded as settled facts. This is the case for the conclusion that the Earth is warming and that much of this warming is very likely due to human activities. So, I think there's plenty of evidence to suggest that the consensus within the scientific community is established and empirically confirmed and not in doubt. Now, what does it mean to have a consensus? Well, if you have a consensus, then what one should look at is the risk that's associated with ignoring it. Now, there's a very interesting precedent dating back about 20 or 30 years that involved AIDS and HIV. National Academy of Sciences in the US in 1988 declared that the evidence that HIV causes AIDS is scientifically conclusive. 10 years later, the then president of South Africa, Mbeki, ignored the scientific consensus. He explicitly rejected Western medicine as racist and preferred to treat AIDS with garlic and beetroot instead. His health minister's nickname was Dr. Beetroot. She recently died. What are the consequences of that policy? Consequences of that policy are 330,000 lives lost. This is a paper published just 2 years ago in the Referee Journal. They did an epidemiological analysis of the consequence of that policy of ignoring the scientific consensus. What's the lesson here? The lesson is that ignoring a scientific consensus is something you do at your own risk. It carries grave risks. Now, does it follow from that that skepticism is bad? Everybody wants to be a skeptic. Well, the answer is no, of course not, because real skepticism is terrific. And I, as a psychologist, have done some work on this, and I want to briefly tell you about my data in this regard. I looked at people who processed information in the news media during the Iraq War in 2003. I identified skeptics in a variety of ways. One of them was whether or not they endorsed the weapons of mass destruction as the official, as the true cause for the invasion. What I find is that those people who did not endorse the official reasons processed information more accurately than non-skeptics. And importantly, they discounted misinformation, what some people might call propaganda, but also they were more likely to accept the true information. And that is one crucial thing about real skeptics, that they differentiate between truth and falsehood. Skepticism is not the rejection of everything, because few of us would want to live in a random world, which results if you believe nothing. So, skeptics differentiate truth from falsehood by analyzing and weighing evidence. And because of that differentiation on the basis of evidence, skepticism differs from other psychological states, to mention but a few: denialism or mendacity. Could be others, but skepticism is different from that. So now, what I want to do in the last couple of minutes is to go through a few cases of what skepticism is not. Because just calling oneself a skeptic does not guarantee that one is actually a skeptic. In the same way that Idi Amin awarding himself medals from a London toy shop did not turn him into a military hero. Self-anointed labels do not do the job. Now, of course, there's no question that some climate skeptics are honest skeptics. But it's also the case that others are something else. And I think it's very important, if one wants to have debate, to identify what other things are being performed. Now, outright fabrication is not skepticism. This is an individual who visited Australia recently, Chris Monckton. In one of his many, many colorful slides, he made a claim during one lecture that he put on the internet that the IAU, the International Astronomical Union, says solar changes cause most climate change, and today's warming is normal, and today's global warming will end soon. Well, I sent an email to the president of the IAU, who replied, "Dear Professor Stephan, blah, 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 lots of stuff. This is what's important to highlight." He said, "There is not such a formal position endorsed by the IAU, let alone any claim from the IAU that suggests that global warming can be explained by solar variability. There is no such formal position. Outright fabrication." Now that's not skepticism. People who think that pictures are an index of skepticism are also mistaken. These are the data about the change in Arctic ice volume. I just downloaded that a couple of weeks ago. So it's very current. This is the volume of ice in the Arctic decreasing. Some people circulate pictures on the internet, on blogs, of a submarine that surfaced at the North Pole on the 17th of March, 1959. They construe that to be evidence that the ice couldn't possibly be melting, because otherwise how would a submarine surface 50 years ago? Well, the answer is through cracks that are always there, number one. Number two, pictures are not evidence. In particular, pathetic pictures like this, because it was actually dark when the escape surfaced, because it was before sunrise in the Arctic. And anybody can look up the date and know that that's civil twilight, not daylight. Whatever that picture is, it's not of the event in question. But it's not just the internet that is indulging in that type of stuff. Here we have our national tabloid, the Heart of the Nation, which on its front cover had this certainly very nice gentleman who's been swimming at Bondi Beach for the last 30 years every morning, and who says that the sea levels are not rising. Well, here are the data. That's data, that's science. This is tabloid journalism. If you point out that these are data, then you get labeled by certain people an evangelist, which is a complete inversion of reality, bringing it back to the opening theme of this talk, because as a scientist, I care about data. Evangelists tend to care less about data. And finally, McCarthyite persecutions are also not skepticism. Now, just recently, a couple of weeks ago, the Attorney General of the state of Virginia launched a lawsuit basically against the University of Virginia, requesting the release of all documents ever produced by a certain Professor Michael Mann from 1999 till the present. Every single email, every single document he ever touched, every computer code, and so forth. This 5 years after the professor left the university. Professor Mann was a climate scientist, you may have guessed. And also, despite the fact that the law on which this request was made was passed in 2002 and is not retroactive, didn't stop him from asking for earlier stuff. And also, the law has nothing to do whatsoever with anything one can construe has relevance to climate science. Now, this persecution, it's not a prosecution, it's a persecution. People have recognized, fortunately, here's just one comment from the Washington Post, not exactly a right-wing, left-wing magazine, who they say, "We knew Virginia Attorney General Ken Cuccinelli had declared war in reality. Now he has declared war on the freedom of academic inquiry as well." Nature, the world's preeminent scientific journal, likewise calls Cuccinelli's actions against man similar to an era when tobacco companies smeared researchers as part of a sophisticated public relations strategy to raise doubts over the science showing that tobacco caused cancer and delaying introduction of smoking curbs for decades. The same people, as it turns out, the same individuals are now doing the same thing with climate change. So skepticism is good, it's great, but fabrications, meaningless pictures, and McCarthyite persecutions are not skepticism. And as we will see, neither is junk science, and with that, I'm going to hand over to our next speaker.